Okay, let us continue with the next para. While Ernest had been growing old, God had granted a new poet to this earth. He too was a native of the valley, but had spent the greater part of his life in distant cities, pouring out his sweet music everywhere. Okay. अब ये तीसरा बंदा है जो वैली में जन्म हुआ था उसका, बट ही हैड बीन स्टेइंग अवे फ्रॉम वैली इन फार सिटी एरियाज. Why? Because he was a poet, okay, and he was letting people enjoy his musical thoughts and everything. Okay, so now he thought to return to his birthplace, so he had come here. On one side, Ernest had become old, he was growing old, and the poet who was the resident of the valley, he came back to that place. Neither was the great stone face forgotten, for the poet had celebrated it in a poem. The songs of this poet found their way to Ernest. He read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. Okay, so this poet, the poet we are talking about, he, as I told you, he was a resident of that valley, so he knew everything about his birthplace, even the great stone face. So he had he had composed many poems on the great stone face, and whatever he knew about the great stone face, he just weave those description, those words in a beautiful poem. Okay, so Ernest came to know about those poems about the great stone face, so he was very interested to know those poems. So he started reading the books written by this poet. Okay, so he came across those poems, he was literally enjoying them when he used to recite those poems, or when he used to read those poems, when his customary toil means, see the meaning, usual work. When his usual work was over, he used to sit on the bench in front of his cottage, and he used to read those books written by this poet. तो वो बड़ा फैन हो चुका था इस पोएट का, जिसने ग्रेट स्टोन फेस के ऊपर कविताएं लिखी थी. Okay, as he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain, and every time he used to read the poem or recite the poem, he used to look at the mountain, at the great stone face. "Oh, great stone face," he said, "is not this man worthy to be your likeness?" So he asked the great stone face, क्या ये इंसान जिसने ये कविता लिखी है, क्या ये आपके जैसा दिखता है या दिखता होगा? Because he didn't know that person, right? The face seemed to smile but did not answer. Now great stone face had started smiling towards Ernest. Okay, so he did not, the great stone face did not answer, he just gave a smile. Now it happened that the poet, though he lived so far away, had not only heard of Ernest, but had thought much about his character, and wished to meet this man whose wisdom walked hand in hand with the noble simplicity of his life. The way Ernest came to know about the poet who has written poem on the great stone face, in the same way the poet had come to know about Ernest, his wisdom. So he desired to meet this man whose fame or whose wisdom spread like a wildfire. It went to the city where this poet was living. Okay, one summer day, therefore, he arrived at Ernest's door, where he found the good old man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and then, with a finger between the leaves, looked lovingly at the great stone face. So this poet decided to meet Ernest. So he visited one summer day. He stood in front of the door of Ernest, and he found an old man who was sitting on the bench, and he was reading a book, and he was observing the great stone face very keenly. Okay, "Good evening," said the poet. "Can you give a traveler a night's shelter?" So the poet didn't know that the person he was looking for was sitting in front of him, right in front of him. So he asked that he asked for a night shelter. एक रात रुकने के लिए उसने जगह पूछी कि can he allow, could he allowed him to stay over there. Gladly, answered Ernest. And then he added, smiling, I think I never saw the great stone face look so hospitably at a stranger. So he said, yes, why not? Gladly, खुशी से आप यहाँ पे रह सकते हो. And further he added that he had never seen the great stone face so hospitably looking at the stranger. For the great stone face, the poet was a stranger. But according to Ernest, ग्रेट स्टोन फेस के लिए ये पोएट एक स्ट्रेंजर था, लेकिन उस दिन ग्रेट स्टोन फेस के ऊपर एक अलग ही एक्सप्रेशन था कि वो जानता हो उस स्ट्रेंजर को, राइट. सो ही ऑब्जर्व्ड एंड ही सेड दैट ही हैड नेवर सीन सच एन एक्सप्रेशन ऑन द ग्रेट स्टोन फेस. The poet sat down beside him and he and Ernest talked together. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. Later, both of them started talking with each other. The poet observed Ernest was a wise man, gentle man, and a kind man. In the same way, Ernest also observed the poet. Expressions on his face and everything. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen too. He gazed into the poet's eyes. As Ernest was talking to the poet, Ernest was also observing the great stone face. The great stone face was very eager to listen what both of them were talking. So the great stone face was literally bending down to listen to their conversation. So at this point, Ernest looked into the poet's eyes. उसने उसकी आंखों में झांक के देखा. Who are you, my gifted guest? He asked. आप कौन हो? आप कहाँ से आए हो? The poet laid his finger on the book that Ernest had been reading. The poet, he kept his finger on the book which Ernest was reading, and what he said further, you have read these poems, said he. You know me? Then for I wrote them. ओके तो आप मेरी ही लिखी हुई कविताएं पढ़ रहे हो. ये मैं ही हूँ जिसने ये कविताएं लिखी है. Again and again, Ernest examined the poet's features. He turned towards the great stone face, then back. He shook his head and sighed. Okay. Now, Ernest was looking for the poet because he thought the person who has written these poems on the great stone face might resemble the great stone face. So he looked at the poet and he looked at the great stone face. But afterwards, again, the third time, he was disheartened because the face he was looking for was not the same. So he became very, very sad. Why are you sad? Inquired the poet. Because, replied Ernest, all through life I have awaited the fulfillment of a prophecy. And when I read these poems, I hoped that it might be fulfilled in you. क्या बोला उसने? जिंदगी भर मैं एक भविष्यवाणी की सच होने की सोच रहा था और आपकी कविताएं पढ़कर मुझे ऐसा लगा कि अभी वो सच हो जाएंगी. बट नो, दैट इज नॉट ट्रू. यू होप्ड, आंसर्ड द पोएट, faintly smiling, to find in me the likeness of the great stone face. I am not worthy to its likeness. अच्छा, तो आप मुझ में ग्रेट स्टोन फेस को देख रहे हो? No, I am not that worthy to be its likeness. उसके जैसे दिखने का मैं सोच भी नहीं सकता. Because I am not that person. And why not? Asked Ernest. He pointed to the book. Are not those thoughts worthy? He looked into the book in which he had written the poems about the great stone face. So उसने बोला कि क्यों नहीं, आप क्यों नहीं उसके जैसे दिख सकते? Because you have written or composed these poems. You can hear in them the distant voice of a heavenly song. But my life, dear Ernest, has not corresponded with my thoughts. I have had grand dreams, but they have been only dreams. Sometimes I lack faith in my own thoughts. Why? Why then, pure seeker of the good and true, should you hope to find me in the face of the mountain? So what reason this poet gave to Ernest? He had been struggling very hard throughout his life to achieve his dreams. But later on he lost faith in himself. उसने खुद के ऊपर का विश्वास गंवा दिया कि वो अपने ड्रीम्स अचीव नहीं कर सकता. And because of this reason he cannot resemble the great stone face. What was the prophecy? The person who would resemble the great stone face would be wise enough, thoughtful person, kind enough, gentle, humble, hard working. ऐसा वो इंसान होगा. But this poet was not at all like the great stone face, right? The poet spoke sadly and his eyes were wet with tears. So too were those of Ernest. तो ये बोल के दोनों रोने लगे. At the hour of sunset, as had long been his custom, Ernest was to speak to a group of neighbors in the open air. Together he and the poet went to the meeting place, arm in arm. From there could be seen the great stone face. So उसके बाद दोनों ने decide किया. It was customary for Ernest to go to a group of neighbors, and they used to sit in the evening and they used to chat. बातें करते थे, एक दूसरे के विचार शेयर करते थे, थॉट्स शेयर करते थे. So he took poet that evening with him and they went to that group. Ernest threw a look of a familiar kindness around upon his audience. He began to speak to the people what was in his heart and mind. His words had power because they agreed with his thoughts, and his thoughts had reality and depth because they harmonized with life which he had always lived. लोग वहाँ पे उसकी बातें सुनने के लिए आते थे every evening. So why did people believe in him? Because whatever he used to speak was a fact, and it was very humbly, very politely he used to connect with the people. It was not mere breath that the preacher uttered. They were the words of life. A life of good deeds and selfless love was melted into them. The poet, as he listened, felt that the life and character of Ernest were a nobler strain of poetry than he had ever written. Poet ने भी जैसे उसकी बातें सुननी चालू की, so he was also mesmerized. क्या बातें करता है ये इंसान? Wow, what a thought! कितने सुंदर विचार करता है ये इंसान. एंड ही इज लिटरली प्रीचिंग पीपल, लोगों को एक सीख दे रहा है. व्हाई नॉट टू कंपोज अ पोएम ऑन हिम? he started thinking like that. His eyes filled with tears and he said to himself that never was there so worthy a sage as that mild, sweet, thoughtful face with the glory of white hair diffused about it. इतना प्यारा इंसान, इतना हम्बल इंसान, thoughtful face, sweet, mild person he had never seen in his life. और उसके सर के ऊपर जो सफ़ेद बाल थे अर्नेस्ट के indicated his wisdom. पूरा एक्सपीरियंस लाइफ उसका थ्रू आउट जो लाइफ उसने एक्सपीरियंस गैदर किया था वो उसके सफ़ेद बाल बता रहे थे. At a distance, but clearly to be seen, high up in the golden light of the setting sun, appeared the great stone face with white mist around it, like the white hair around the brow of Ernest. और पीछे की तरफ जहाँ पे अर्नेस्ट बैठे थे उसके पीछे ग्रेट स्टोन फेस था. सिमिलरली वैसे ही द वाइट मिस्ट जो होती है ना वाइट कलर की, लाइक क्लाउडी मिस्टी थिंग, वो ग्रेट स्टोन की फेस के आईब्रोज के पास आके गैदर हो गई, एग्जैक्टली लाइक दी अर्नेस्ट आईब्रोज. ओके. At that moment, Ernest's face took on an expression so grand that the poet was moved to throw his arms up and shout. और जैसे ही अर्नेस्ट बातें करने लगा, the expression came on the Ernest's face. At that moment, the poet shouted, literally he raised his hand and he shouted, "Behold, behold, Ernest is himself the likeness of the great stone face." Behold means देखो, देखो, सब जन देखो कि अर्नेस्ट ही वही इंसान है जिसका फेस ग्रेट स्टोन फेस से मिलता है. Okay? Then all the people looked and saw that that the poet said was true. सब लोग पीछे ग्रेट स्टोन फेस की तरफ देखते रहे और फिर अर्नेस्ट के फेस की तरफ देख रहे थे. And they all believed in the poet. The prophecy was fulfilled. But Ernest, having finished what he had to say, took the poet's arm and walked slowly homeward, still hoping that some wiser and better man than himself would by and by appear, bearing a resemblance to the great stone face. The poet believed in the prophecy. The people of the village, they believed in the prophecy, and they agreed that yes, Ernest had the resemblance of the great stone face. But Ernest, he himself did not believe in, because he thought that someday a person would come who would resemble the great stone face. तो वो अग्री नहीं था कि नहीं, मेरा फेस नहीं दिखता ग्रेट स्टोन फेस के जैसा. बट ही बिलीव्ड दैट वन डे द पर्सन वुड रियली कम हु वुड बी वाइजर एंड बेटर देन हिम. सो गाइज, व्हाट डू यू थिंक? डिड द प्रोफेसी कम ट्रू? I think yes, the prophecy had come true, and Ernest was the person which he was himself looking for. वही वो इंसान था, because the great stone face जिससे भी resemble करेगा वो इंसान कैसा होगा? He would be humble, polite, hardworking, gentle, always welcoming, giving always welcoming smile, thoughtful person. So Ernest was the only person who would resemble the great stone face. Okay, but he himself did not believe that he